Emma Norton. Emma Norton from the Climate Emergency Unit of the South Shore chapter of the Council of Canadians. Motivated by climate emergency, she has been working in Canada's energy sector for nearly a decade, specifically in the area of energy efficiency and deep energy retrofits. She has effectively intervened in provincial utility hearings to ensure increasing ambition of demand-side management programs. She ran the Climate Jobs Roundtable, a series of events that focused on job creation and transitioning the energy economy. As the Nova Scotia lead for the international project Smarter Energy Communities in Northern and Arctic regions of Europe, Emma facilitated knowledge transfer between communities in Canada and Europe who are seeking to reduce their carbon footprint through smarter energy use. Currently, Emma works as a consultant for projects related to climate justice and more specifically housing, low carbon buildings and retrofits as climate solutions. Now Emma is the Atlantic Canada organizer and director of communications with the Climate Emergency Unit. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Sherry. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and thanks to the coalition for inviting me. I think it's amazing that it's confusing about whether or not I work for the Council of Canadians. I do work closely with them, though not for them. But right now I'm dog sitting for my friend. So I'm sitting in the office of my friend who works for the Council of Canadians. So I'm just having a bit of a Twilight Zone moment here. So thanks again for inviting me to be here today. I also want to acknowledge that I live and work in Mi'kma'ki, specifically in Bunimagwajuk, which is Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And so what I do work for a project called the Climate Emergency Unit, which is a project, a 5-year project of the David Suzuki Institute. And we work with all sectors to find solutions to the climate crisis. We seek to move governments and leaders in Canada into true climate emergency mode and press them to adopt ambitious policies that align with what science says we must do. Our work is based on a book written by Seth Klein called The Good War, which examines how we might mobilize for the climate crisis, similarly to how we mobilized for the Second World War in Canada on the home front. So, the latest report from the International Panel on Climate Change was released in August of this year. And it left many of us reeling. It had a very dire warning. We have only 9 years at our current greenhouse gas emission levels to have a 66% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And for many communities and people in the world, you will often hear the words 1.5 to survive. From an equity standpoint, from looking at the most vulnerable populations throughout the world, including in Nova Scotia, in Canada, the most vulnerable populations are on the coast, or they will not be able to grow crops or have access to clean drinking water if we exceed the 1.5 degree warming mark. So as we watch the COP negotiations, which are ongoing in Glasgow right now, you're going to hear this term 1.5 to survive a lot. And that's why this decade that we are currently in, leading up to 2030, is so important for climate action. And so climate scientists urge policymakers to consider the world's carbon budget and what each jurisdiction, be it Nova Scotia or Halifax, and what each sector, whether it's transportation or buildings, carbon budget should be. So to have a good chance of remaining within our budget, we need to reduce our emissions globally by 10% a year in order to, and get other and have all emissions, whether it's carbon or methane, to follow a similar pathway. And that's fairly substantial because, last year during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw emissions go down by 6.4% globally. And that was with a massive inconveniencing of every person in their daily lives. And even with that level of individual behavioral change where we're not flying, we're not driving, we're all just kind of staying put at home, we didn't get that 10% annual reduction deemed necessary by scientists. And this just hits home again, the fact that voluntary individual actions, where we as individuals are told to act on our own and drive less and make and turn out our lights, that's not what's going to save us. Although that seems to be what we hear the most often in the media, and through each other and through government policy. And it's been incredible that we've been forced to believe that we need to feel guilty about our individual actions when it's actually just 100 companies in the world that are responsible for 3/4 of the emissions globally. And so this idea of individual action, while it's important for us to feel like we can contribute to the solution, it's actually an idea that was seeded by the fossil fuel industries. It's actually BP, British Petroleum, that popularized the idea of a carbon footprint. So, I want to point the finger, and I want to point the blame and shame these companies for knowing for decades about climate change, but doing their very best to avoid responsibility. They went from denying to finger pointing to individuals. And now what we hear most often from fossil fuel companies and the people that have been convinced by them is that we have no chance of avoiding 1.5 degree increase in temperature. And that's just not true. We absolutely have a chance of avoiding 1.5 degrees if we start to treat the climate crisis like the emergency that it is. So what is going to save us is us working together to change the direction we are heading and forcing governments into emergency mode. So I've worked for 10 years now as a climate campaigner or a climate organizer, which for many of you will not seem like a long time. For me, it feels like a long time. And I have seen the narrative change in those 10 years. I've seen when I joined this movement, when I was in university more than 10 years ago, it was very unlikely to hear a politician even admit that climate change is caused by humans. And it's a very different situation today. And during all that time, even though I was pushing so hard for climate action, I found it quite challenging to articulate what climate emergency action would look like. And that's why I found the book A Good War by Seth Klein so inspiring. It just very clearly articulates what climate emergency action would look like, because we can look to the Second World War. And then just as Seth was publishing his book about emergency response based on the Second World War mobilization on the home front, we entered into a pandemic. So we have another example of what emergency mobilization could look like if we were to tackle the emergency like in the way that it needs to be. So I'm going to talk about the 5 markers of climate emergency mode. So we've identified 4 markers specifically based on what needs to happen based on what did happen during the Second World War and to a point during the COVID-19 mobilization that we're still living within. And then there's a 5th marker, which I'll talk about, and I think is what brings us all here today. So marker number 1 of a government in emergency mode is a government that spends what it takes to win. And spending what it takes to win, according to the former World Bank chief economist, Nicholas Stern, is 2% of a government's GDP. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, our government's committed to spending what it takes to ensure the safety of our citizens. We've heard Premier Houston say again and again that he's willing to spend what it takes to tackle the healthcare crisis in Nova Scotia. But up to this point, we haven't seen nearly enough spending we haven't seen even close to 2% spending on the climate crisis. We spent $5 billion a week last year on COVID-19. We spent $5 billion a year on the climate crisis, and that's the most we've ever spent on the climate crisis in Canada. So we have a long ways to go. In Nova Scotia, 2% of our GDP, based on the 2019 GDP, would be about $750 million annually. According to the platform of the PC government, they were going to spend about $7 million over 4 years. But I think given some of the action we've already seen, we can expect their spending to be higher. And I think that together we can push them to spend much more on climate emergency action. So marker number 2 of a government in emergency mode is that it creates new institutions to get the job done. This is generally more within the federal jurisdiction, but this can definitely be done at the provincial level. During the Second World War, in order to meet the military production and social needs of its population, Canada created 28 new crown corporations. So within 2 years, due to the creation of these crown corps, Canada increased manufacturing of aircraft 25-fold. Before the war, shipbuilders numbered only 2,000, and at the end of the war, there were 30,000 shipbuilders. We committed to making sure that every veteran, when they came back from the war, had a home to live in. Housing became a right after the war. So obviously not in legislation as we're experiencing today. So I want to clarify that statement, but suddenly the government was committed to ensuring that people had housing, and we can do the same thing again. And I think at the provincial level, this might not look like it won't look like a national crown corp, but it might look like our efficiency utility chasing greenhouse gas emission reductions instead of chasing efficiency. Maybe we'll have a provincial retrofit or housing body that makes sure that everyone is homed and lives in a super energy efficient home. There are lots of ways that marker number 2 about creating institutions could be recognized at the provincial level. Marker number 3 is that a government moves from voluntary change to mandatory change with clear targets and near-term dates. So this, during the pandemic, our governments issued health orders and they took strong action to shut down non-essential parts of the economy when needed. But when it comes to the climate emergency, actions taken to date have been almost entirely voluntary. We incentivize change, we encourage change, we offer rebates, we send price signals, but we have not required change. So we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For instance, we should mandate that all new buildings will not be permitted to use natural gas or other fossil fuels as of 2023. Like, why are we in the year 2021 still building new buildings that heat with oil? Why are we not setting mandates that every manufacturer has to create mostly electric vehicles, if not all? That kind of mandatory change is going to be necessary for the climate emergency. And marker number 4 is tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and the measures necessary to combat it. The leaders that we remember best from the Second World War were outstanding communicators and orators who walked a careful line. They were forthright about the gravity of the crisis, yet they still managed to impart hope. Similarly, that's how we present governments that have modeled emergency communication throughout the pandemic. So we received press briefings, we hear regularly from public health officials, the media has taken seriously its duty to provide the necessary information on a daily basis. But government leaders and media have listened to science and health experts and have acted accordingly. And we haven't seen that in response to the climate crisis. So I just want to check in on my time here. I think I was told I have 20 minutes, but I will cut myself short if I need to. I just want to get to marker number 5.
Great. Yep. You've got a couple more minutes, Emma. I just wanted to give you the cue there that we're just about wrapping up with you.
Okay. Okay. So marker number 5 is that we leave no one behind. So emergency mobilizations require social cohesion, and inequality undermines that kind of collaboration. The COVID-19 pandemic has lifted the veil on inequities in our society. So, in the Second World War, we saw lots of social structures and social supports introduced to help create solidarity, like the Universal Income Security Program, the Universal Family Allowance, unemployment insurance. It's essential when we move forward in an emergency that we don't exacerbate inequity. I'm trying to get to the point here so that I can get to my call to action. I have a lot to say, which I feel like if there's going to be a question and answer session, maybe I can bring it up then. I do have a call to action that I would love to invite people to participate in.
Absolutely. At the end of the session, we will have about 30 minutes for question and answer.
Okay, great. So I do want to point out that right now, the province has introduced a Bill 57, which is the Environmental Goals and Climate Change Reduction Act. And this is the piece of legislation that is intended to lead the province through the next 20 or 30 years of climate action. And though it's the best climate bill that we've seen in Nova Scotia, it's still woefully inadequate when it comes to climate action. It's not emergency level at all. The nearest target is 2030. There's nothing in there about phasing out fossil fuels. There's very little for social supports. So yesterday, many of us spoke at law amendments, including Alex Stratford. I did, the EAC did. There was 10 hours of amendments. The bill was passed on to committee of the whole with no amendments last night at 10:20. So we have a 24-hour push in which I encourage you to reach out to your MLAs to support the amendments that were tabled yesterday. And I will make that as easy as possible for you or anyone who is interested. We have a letter that we'll be sending that is currently getting written by a group of folks who spoke yesterday. And it's a little bit of a form letter, but we encourage people to write their own letters with a few specific bullet points, because we anticipate that the opposition parties will put forward some amendments, but what we need is for the PC party to support those amendments and to put forward their own that turn this bill into a stronger foundation upon which to build climate action.
Thank you, Emma. So as I mentioned, you will have a chance to speak with Emma and direct any questions around the 1 o'clock mark. So I'm going to move on now to introducing our second speaker on the call. So we have with us George Baraney. George Baraney is with the Just Recovery Network in Lunenburg County. This network formed as a result of meetings between Lunenburg County members of Council of Canadians and Extinction Rebellion concerned about the effects of COVID and the climate crisis. Both issues had highlighted the inequities and structural causes of our problems and the urgent need for social, racial, environmental, and economic justice. The Just Recovery Network is connecting with other local groups and organizations to map out concerns and issues and what a local just recovery would look like. We plan to approach the 5 councils to convince them to engage in a collaboration for a just recovery across the county. George was involved in helping establish Extinction Rebellion Nova Scotia and has worked on a number of their actions. He is also a chair of the nonprofit Family Service Association Western Nova Scotia, which provides services to youth and families and housing support. This organization is also engaged in obtaining funding for a net zero emission 50-unit affordable housing project on a brownfield commercial site they have purchased. So welcome to George.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin by addressing climate justice and vulnerabilities quite broadly, and then try to move down to a local level. So let me start with COVID, because to me, COVID serves as a microcosm for understanding climate justice. I see COVID as having kind of squished into a couple of years many of the elements of the climate crisis which have unfolded over several decades. And COVID has shown us a number of things, possibilities of how to respond to an existential threat, how that impacts the most vulnerable people, and the systemic factors that prevent effective responding. I think humans are really good at responding to immediate threats and crises such as disasters and wars. However, we kind of suck at threats that take decades to unfold, even when we know what the dangers are. We saw this with smoking and cancer as corporate interests launched misinformation campaigns and smokers denied or rationalized the health risks. We're also following a similar path in regards to climate crisis. We're denying and delaying. We can move to another country, we can go to a different area, we can grow on our own food, we can live off the grid. However, those options are kind of like ensuring that you have the best seat in the lifeboat as the ship goes down. we're following that path right now. And COVID has taught us that there are many responses we can make. There's masks, there's social distancing, there's vaccines. And COVID has also taught us that these things are differentially experienced as a function of the vulnerabilities that we have. So those could be age, occupation, race, it could even be political affiliation. And all of this tends to intersect with the priorities of capitalism. For example, our most effective response to COVID would have been to remove patent protections on vaccines. Were we facing the typical Hollywood apocalyptic kind of crisis, governments would be leading, not businesses and corporations. With climate, our most effective responses are to quickly phase out burning of fossil fuels, ramp up sustainable energy production, and reduce our consumption. But as with vaccines, we are constrained by our ideologies about profit, and we prioritize the economy above human life and the life of the planet. I think to understand climate justice and address it necessitates that we view it as a product of a colonial neoliberal worldview based on consumerism, which fuels wealth extraction from people and the planet and produces increasing inequality in global heating. It will result in hundreds of millions of climate refugees no longer able to inhabit their homelands. And it will eradicate a sense of reciprocity and a spiritual connection that people have to their homelands. I know that sounds tremendously bleak. Yet to understand the root causes is kind of a grounds for optimism, as it broadens the field of support available to address this problem. We have potential allies fighting poverty, inequality, discrimination, racism, capitalism. All these groups are having to deal with a colonial structure which has created the problems they are trying to fix and the suffering in the populations that most of them are advocating for. Climate justice is about kind of protecting those vulnerable populations. Climate justice implies that we recognize the impacts of the climate crisis and that those impacts aren't going to be borne equally. It'll affect rich and poor differently, older and younger generations. It'll have differing social, economic impacts. It will exacerbate inequalities and the social conditions faced by low-income communities, people of color, Indigenous people, people with disabilities. And these are the people who have a disproportionately low responsibility for causing emissions. And they're the ones who are worst hit and suffer the most. And correcting that requires working directly. It may be providing water, housing, infrastructure, financial aid, medical aid. It may also involve less direct work, rebuilding, mitigating future climate events, reducing our emissions, planning what we do with climate refugees. And it's going to require addressing the worldview that's driving global warming. In the climate crisis, the most vulnerable are in the global south. And in those countries, probably Indigenous climate activists are especially vulnerable. They live in regimes that have few protections and that are violent. They receive harsher treatment. Within our own country, we see this in terms of Indigenous activists, people of color, and the poor. And across the world, we're also witnessing an increase in the surveillance state and a move to criminalize protest and create harsher penalties. Climate justice must address that repression of protest. We need activists because they play an important role in pressuring governments to respond to the causes and to advocate for the vulnerable. We also have to address the divide and conquer tactics that are used to delay addressing the problems. Tactics of pitting working people and those with jobs in the fossil fuel sector against people who are trying to solve these problems. framing protest as against the economy, as engaged in by socialists and agitators, and that if we cater to those people, it will result in the economy suffering higher fuel costs instead of in resulting in a better, maybe more just world. I think most of the world has bought, or a lot of the world has brought into that destructive colonial model, and how it has produced inequality and environmental destruction. What we see is a lot of profits being extracted, and how people who are doing that are gaming the system to redistribute wealth upwards. The RAND Corporation recently estimated that the top 20% in the United States have funneled $43 trillion upwards from the bottom 80% over the last 50 years. And we also know that the top 10% now produce something like 50% of global emissions. That wealth extraction places a double burden on the most vulnerable, increasing inequality and subjecting them to the effects of global warming. Let me transition to talking about what we can do locally. In Lunenburg, we've been connecting with groups who have been addressing some of these issues around inequality and impacts for decades. One group, Citizens for Public Transit, have been advocating for transit systems on the South Shore. I will not go into all the obstacles, but a key one is getting the 5 councils in the area to collaborate and to share resources to develop that system. Bridgewater so far is the only jurisdiction that has done so. This may not seem to have much to do with climate justice, but it's interesting to note that in Nova Scotia, we stopped running the rail service and we did not replace it with any other option for people in regards to transit, forcing many to buy extra cars, and that has had multiple negative impacts. A chunk of those car sale profits go out of the community to the manufacturer, so they're not being spent locally. People have, because they can't socialize as much, become more isolated, and that has tremendous health effects for people. And then people can't get to appointments, or they have to spend more because they have to cab to appointments. And all of this starts increasing costs. People have to rely on social services to fund some of that. Minimum wage employees may not be able to take jobs because they're too far to walk and it's too expensive to cab to. And then the increased emissions create health effects. So a public transit system would lead us to less wealth extraction, lower emissions, and provide cheaper transportation. And though most of us see transit as for people in the low income group, transit actually benefits all of us. It reduces families' needs to have 2 or 3, even 3 cars to get to work. And it connects the vulnerable to their community and to their friendship networks. The second area where climate justice creates tremendous inequality is where it intersects with affordable housing. The per capita homeless rate in Lunenburg is typically greater than Halifax. 9-month stats from a local housing program indicate 39 seniors, 57 children, and 84 adults as homeless or facing homelessness within 30 days. And when we read about homelessness, we think about urban settings, about single adults. Governments don't report the adult stats, or report the adult stats, and those stats omit children, and the children connected to those adults. What happens to them? We know that child protection services have, in some instances, apprehended children who are homeless through no fault of their own because parents have not been able to find housing. That's not acceptable. Lack of affordable housing is a form of wealth extraction. The median Halifax 1-bedroom rent is about $1,600 with utilities. Rural rents in our area are about $1,000. There's no housing, and there's a lack of supply, so there's actually no housing. The rapid escalation of rents and housing, lack of housing stock creates the homelessness crisis. And 1 in 4 children now live in poverty. Governments tend to over-rely on developers to build housing, and they provide those developers with incentives. Those units usually are 80% of median rent, and typically they're only on the market for 10 to 20 years. And those median rents are not affordable to a lot of people. The Family Service Association of Western Nova Scotia and their director, Art Fisher, are approaching the affordable housing situation in a fairly innovative manner. They've created what they call a comprehensive transferable template for social housing to be demonstrated at 641 King Street in Bridgewater. It will be a 50-unit housing Main Street civic development that will provide supported and affordable housing into perpetuity, not just for 10 or 20 years. There's 7 elements to that template. The first is that affordable housing is social housing and should be built and managed by the nonprofit sector, which is capable of supporting people who need housing the most and in generating wealth within the community. Those developments should be brownfield sites, which exist in most towns, often in ideal locations, and they allow us to clean up those existing commercial sites and to eliminate the unsustainable extension of new infrastructure. Developers love greenfield sites, which are in pristine forested areas. But then for those sites, municipalities and taxpayers have to supply sewage, hydro, streets, and a variety of infrastructure. Our project on King Street will also be a net zero energy project demonstrating a capacity to eliminate energy poverty. It will be run on geothermal and solar. It will include universal design in which the complete project is accessible from the street and permits people to stay in the same unit as they age or become ill. Universal design should not be an option in affordable housing. It's critical for responding to needs of an aging population. Social housing units also need to be more affordable. We look at trying to create this project at 50% of median market rate. And that's going to leave a lot of money in pockets of renters, which will be spent most likely locally and support local economies. The nonprofit sector has a capacity to build and support affordable housing, and many of them already work with marginalized populations who they can support in that housing. And that housing will also provide the capacity for linking with coordinated access systems. Now, increasingly, those of us concerned about the climate are trying to collaborate with other groups who are working on initiatives such as poverty, inequality, discrimination. Seeing that these issues overlap can make it easier to support each other. However, organizations can also be very territorial and approach situations as a competition for resources, whether those be grants, donations, and media attention. It's helpful to see this territoriality as a sign of basically capitalist worldview, which sets us to compete against each other, as opposed to a worldview of one where there's abundance if we were better stewards of our environment. Governments are skilled at pitting us against each other over resources and access to power, and this often leads groups to prioritize their particular concern over others' concerns instead of trying to work to address the interests of all of us. Sometimes look at it as when we think of the word ours, O-U-R-S. For most of us, that brings to mind a sense of ownership or possession. And that's a colonizing mindset. A decolonizing mindset would look at ours and hear and feel connection, recognizing that issues are interconnected and that we can mitigate competition when we work on connection. Also, although collaboration is good, it's not necessary. Too much of the work in the energy sector and nonprofits and activist organizations seeks collaboration and reaching of consensus. And although that's important, this is not really to me about achieving collective agreement, but about how we invite collective thriving Can we avoid the intergroup conflict, the ideology, the tactics, the methods, and needing to agree, and instead focus, how can we help each of our organizations thrive? Can we see the common cause helps us be less critical of others, that it opens us to how others' efforts could probably help our cause? I'm reminded of what happened in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King. This occurred in a context in which there was a Black Panther mobilization of inner cities. Malcolm X was working with the Nation of Islam. These groups were fairly radical, and they were doing tactics that had a common aim to what the civil rights movement was trying to achieve. And the existence of those radical movements, I think, made it easier for governments to look at King and say, we'd rather deal with that than the radical organizations. And that led to tremendous changes in the lives of Black people. We see the version of this in the climate sphere. Many of us look at the tactics that Extinction Rebellion uses as being radical, but it's sometimes those tactics that make other people working in the environmental movements attractive to governments and saying, we will deal with these people. In this work, many of us look to influence policy, secure funds and services. All of this is necessary to create change. How often though, it doesn't lead to structural change or empowerment. Our individual focus and desire to better lives is necessary, but needs to occur with an analysis of what structural changes would make our efforts meaningful. The demand to stop funding and subsidizing fossil fuels is a structural change. Asking for a carbon tax is not a structural change. Asking for a carbon tax is helpful, and we should advocate for it, but we need to keep our eye on what are the structural changes that will move this. What are those emergency responses? At a local level, we can advocate for resources, but lasting change is empowering community members to create that change and create change that retains wealth. We can build our own housing. We can build our own sustainable energy instead of paying developers in Nova Scotia power. Lunenburg has 40% of its population living in energy poverty. Could we supply some of that power? That would mean that money would remain in the community instead of going to shareholders in Emira.
George, I'm just going to interrupt you just for a second to say
Okay.
we're getting short on time, and we will bring you back in the question and answer piece.
Sure.
Are you just about ready to wrap up?
I can sort of very quickly do it in about 1 minute, I think.
Great.
Okay, so people worldwide are aware the system is broken. They're identifying that colonial worldview that is at the heart of the damage. They're looking at wealth extraction from communities, and we're receiving more and more attention over the last number of years, and more people are working on this. And that may help prevent the slide into poverty and address the climate crisis. And they're realizing that there is a corporate capture of our governments, and that governments are ignoring what people want and what surveys show people want, and instead responding to what corporations and elites want. And people are realizing that although governments make promises and pledges to address these, what we need is legally binding pledges. And maybe the final note I will add, I've talked a lot about people and what we do for people, but climate justice is also about biodiversity and protecting our forests and protecting our species, and we need to address that. Thank you.
Thank you, George. She had some great points there. I'm a big fan of that whole idea of moving from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. And I think mindset is where a lot of change can occur. Our final speaker today, who is in the land of the fog, Unama'ki, is Rob Harris, a senior manager from the Clean Foundation. Rob is a certified energy advisor with Natural Resources Canada, a certified energy manager with the Association of Energy Engineers, and a current student in Simon Fraser University's nonprofit management program. Having completed a master's in history and social change from the University of Western Ontario, Rob has focused his research on the social, economic, political, and cultural shifts that occurred as a result of deindustrialization on Cape Breton Island. With over 15 years of experience working in Nova Scotia's nonprofit sector, Rob is actively attempting to make impactful changes at the crossroads of environmental issues and social equity in his current role as Senior Manager at the Clinton Foundation. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, so I'll get a little bit in. My presentation may not be as academic or as theoretical as Emma's and George's, but super engaging and thoughtful presentations. I really appreciate both of those perspectives. So as Sherry mentioned, I am the Senior Manager here at the Clean Foundation. I'm also a coordinating member of the Cape Breton Climate Change Task Force. I'm also a board member for ACAP Cape Breton and a board member for the Cape Breton 1000 Authority. So I'm not typically the person that gets in front of the camera like this. I appreciate the calls to action and the discussion from Emma and George. Personally, I am a bit more I am passionate about climate action. I am in my day-to-day life a bit more of a climate pragmatist. So I have a tendency to encourage policy that is continually progressive and much more inclusive. Most of my time is spent working with current organizations, policies, people, the folks that are currently in place to make the most impactful solutions possible in the moment. So I'd like to give a little bit of a background, kind of my entry point into this conversation, into this sector, and then I'll speak a bit more in depth to the organizations that I represent and some of the practical solutions that exist on the ground in Nova Scotia today. So my background, as Sherry mentioned, I am a historian by trade. So I studied, unlike many historians or academics, I did not focus in on a very specific node of history. I studied what was kind of the guns, germs, and steel version of history, the big history stuff, looking at change over different timescales. So both very large and very small. In terms of large scale change, very interested in environmental history, the role that the environment has played in human development and the effect that humans have in turn had on our natural environment. So, you know, the kind of quip that I usually use is to understand the implications of resource extraction and fossil fuel consumption. You have to understand how the coal got in the ground. Having that understanding of the long durée of history gives you a better sense. It's kind of that view from space of Earth. You know, you realize what limited resources we are working with and the impact of our actions. On a much smaller scale, I'm very much interested in the role of social movements and how political opportunities, framing mechanisms, and mobilizing structures lead to social activism and changes in culture. So in our context, you know, high electricity costs and climate change, those are in turn political opportunities. Those are situations that we are dealing with. Framing mechanisms become the way that we speak about those and convey information to the public, how we present information to people that inspires them to act. And the mobilizing structures is kind of where I step in my day-to-day life and where many of us do. That is the network of organizations and individuals that affect change, that provide the structures and the vehicles for change that we can get behind. So I wrote my thesis on Cape Breton Island and kind of two shifts. The shift from to an industrial society in around 1900, when we saw the rise of kind of industrial mining and steel production, and the shift that had on our culture. So as we became more dependent on resource extraction and large-scale industry, the effect that had on the social network, the social kind of sinew of our society. Folks that were typically cared for in home by their family and community members were institutionalized. They were no longer a functional unit of production in society, and we had to find ways to deal with that as a culture. Now, as the year 2000 approaches, we have about a 100-year history here in Cape Breton where we were in the depths of industrial production. We have lost much of our coal mining operations. All of our coal now comes from the largest open pit mine in Colombia, shipped up the coast. The steel plant has been gone for over 20 years. So now we're in a different period of growth and change in Cape Breton, one that is underpinned by kind of a network, a social safety net of programs and services that have come in response to the different economic realities of our community. So I'm very interested personally in the interaction between the environment and society in my home community. As far as my involvement in the kind of nonprofit world, how I've come to my position here at Clean, I was originally the public relations coordinator, one of my first jobs, public relations coordinator for the United Way of Cape Breton. So again, that gave me a real sense of the different organizations that make up that social framework of Cape Breton Island, the different types of social services and groups that may be engaging with individuals and inadvertently with climate change and things like environmental racism and the effects of energy poverty without even knowing it. These are just folks that are looking to make a difference in their own community, don't even realize that they have an environmental lens. So here at Clean, about 12 years ago, I took a job here at Clean installing light bulbs. I was one of the first folks in the province that was going around installing LED lights in units, apartment units and private homes. I took to coordinating a crew of folks that did that, then managing the provincial operation for that. I now manage the energy department here at Clean and have a bit more of a role in kind of organizational strategy and program development. As Sherry mentioned, I am a certified energy auditor. I do quality assurance for Natural Resources Canada. I've been fortunate through Clean to have gotten a bunch of technical training that kind of adds to my academic interests. And I'm trying to marry that technical with the nonprofit management stuff, you know. So again, the organizations I represent, Clean, ACAP, the Climate Change Task Force, both like Housing Nova Scotia and its housing authorities. I'll talk about some of those specific programs that we get into, the way that we work. So for folks that aren't familiar with Clean, Clean is an environmental charity that was started in the 80s. We're not a small organization. We're about 90 full-time employees spread all across Nova Scotia. And that includes an office in Dartmouth, but also an office here in my home in Sydney in Bunamagi, the land of fog. We have departments in energy, workforce development, education, coastal protection and restoration, and transportation. And all of those, because of our charitable mandate, all of those departments work at that crossroads of social issues and environmental issues. We firmly believe that like all Nova Scotians have the right and should have the opportunity to participate in the green economy. And this isn't just like a theoretical discussion that really underpins the type of work that we pursue as an organization. So examples of this in action. I guess, you know, we have our workforce development team. We provide wage subsidies for jobs through programs like Science Horizons and Green Jobs. Those are both federal programs. But here in Nova Scotia, we offer a clean leadership program. It's a stream that's specifically dedicated to providing kind of a first opportunity for folks to get their foothold in the green economy, get some meaningful experience in work placements. Within that, we have hundreds of folks across Nova Scotia doing 9 and 15-week internships. We have specific streams that are dedicated to African Nova Scotian youth as well as Indigenous youth. We recognize that there are gaps and barriers to education and employment opportunities. So we specifically try to kind of shine a light on those gaps in programs and services and create solutions that address those issues. Those programs are hugely popular, and you know, feedback we've gotten from communities is that it's really impactful experience for those youth. Some of our other programs, you know, our coastal protection crew has worked a lot along the Northumberland Strait on salt marsh restoration. Mi'kmaq knowledge keepers and Indigenous ways of learning are just key to the way that we engage with our natural environment here at Clean. So, you know, to George's point, you know, collaboration between organizations may not always be necessary, In this case, I think it absolutely is, and in a lot of cases, the folks that are doing remedial work and working on our natural environment just do not have the embedded knowledge from the Indigenous community that ensures that land-based teaching is making its way back into the actions that we take. The Energy Department, as I mentioned, I'm the manager of the Energy Department. That's where I have the most experience, so it's probably where I can speak most in depth. Basically, the way that energy programming for housing in Nova Scotia has worked over the last decade or so is that not just for housing, but we will, as a province, create programs to address the low-hanging fruit. So we'll create a business program, and we'll create a community program, and then we'll create a homeowner program, and they're all based on rebates. We'll pay you, incentivize you to take appropriate action. But then we realize, oh, well, we don't have folks that even with an incentive can afford the right amount of deep energy retrofits. So we'll say, okay, we'll create a low-income program, homeowner. So that's for low-income homeowners, there's no charge. And then we realize, oh, you need to own your home if you want to participate in that program. Okay, we need something for Mi'kmaq communities. So we create the Mi'kmaq Home Energy Efficiency Program. Again, similar to home warming, but for that Indigenous model of ownership. And we say, okay, well, there's still low-income renters. There's no way to incentivize landlords to take the appropriate action, and renters don't have agency. So we've got an affordable housing program. And every time you create these programs, you're noticing those gaps and creating a solution. The gaps get smaller and smaller, but they're still there. There's still folks that fall between the cracks. And it also creates a bunch of market confusion, right? It becomes impossible for people who don't have an education in this industry, in this sector, to just open up the phone book and know exactly which program they should apply for. If you're a renter, do I have to go through my landlord's business program, or do I have any agency to just partake as an individual tenant? So Claim works in a bunch of those programs. As I said, we want to work in spaces where we have a social impact. So we work with low-income homeowners in Mi'kmaq communities, with renters, and as much as possible, we want to try to add flexibility to those programs so it's not prescriptive. We can offer custom solutions that meet people where they're at. But we also recognize that there's a need for more systemic change in how we operate. If we can get away from offering individual programs and just offer deep retrofit services for Nova Scotians. The reality is every building in our province needs to be renovated. We need deep energy retrofits, and we need it to be as simple as possible for people to engage and get excited about this work. More than that, though, we also need people to be involved in the work and to see the benefits, not only from living in the buildings that are now more energy efficient, but from having a job that renovates buildings. So we, as a social organization, as a charity, we often have that kind of social mandate that makes us the most appropriate organization to engage in some of this work currently. But we're not the right organization, right? The right organization doesn't exist yet. It's one that's made up of individuals from the communities being served. So we need a workforce that more accurately represents the mosaic of Nova Scotia. And we need self-determined communities that have agency in their own energy future. So, a few examples of how we're trying to affect change in that respect. We are currently running a program pilot. It's through the province of Nova Scotia, the Native Council of Nova Scotia, through the Canadian Federation of Municipalities. So we've received almost $1 million to provide meaningful jobs and training for 16 Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our community. These are folks that are not currently represented as energy advisors or not properly represented in the trades. So we're paying them a living wage for 6 months. We're providing them all the tools and equipment, all the safety training. We're networking, we're holding networking events and getting them job placements and wage subsidies with community organizations and trade partners. We're not training these folks so that we can build our own roster or reap the benefits. We really want to, if at the end of the day I can have historically marginalized and vulnerable community members working in every service organization in the province, then that's what success looks like for me. We hope to expand that initiative Atlantic-wide next year. You know, a lot is riding on it. I'm taking a break from my training course this afternoon to be here with you today. But beyond the individual workers, we also recognize that a lot of those historically marginalized communities, East Preston, North Preston, Mi'kmaq communities across the province, engaging with energy issues, they don't have a dedicated staff that can research this stuff, that can decipher, use the decoder ring to figure out how to apply for federal and provincial RFPs, requests for proposals, and submit applications. It's usually a side of the desk project that's left up to housing managers or other community staff, folks that are already overstretched. So really, we recognize that capacity gap, and we want to create a framework where marginalized communities in Nova Scotia have more of a bargaining base, more of an opportunity to advocate for their own self-determination and energy future. So we're trying to create that. We have proposals for things like a Mi'kmaq energy network that will embed professionals in each community. So I just got my little message that time is wrapping up. I don't want to focus solely on clean. To George's point, there are tons of folks in the community that are working towards similar goals. And I do think collaboration and clear boundaries between organizations are super important. I'm super proud to be affiliated with the Climate Change Task Force. For those that are interested in Cape Breton issues, this is a forum of independent folks, organizations, and people. It provides a bit of a support group for those that are experiencing climate anxiety that need to bang their head against the same wall. It's also an opportunity for folks to take concrete actions, to get involved, to learn about what projects are happening in organizations in their community, and to lend their time to post job opportunities, to get their foot in the door in a profession that's meaningful, both for them and for the environment. Just to become aware of the good work that's happening. So we're always taking new members. You don't have to be from Cape Breton, as long as you have an interest in what's going on in this neck of the woods. I'd be happy to share that information. Last, I'll wrap up really quick. Just again, I do have this, like, taking off my clean or ACAP or hat. I do live here in Cape Breton. I'm deeply passionate about the work towards climate change and progress here in Unama'ki. So here in CBRM, we do have new municipal leadership. I'll kind of like start at municipal and zoom out. You know, we've got new municipal leadership with a renewed focus. It's an exciting time of growth and change in Cape Breton. Our population is growing. We're emerging from COVID, hopefully, and we have an opportunity to address some of the crises that are happening on our island in a different way. We have a child poverty rate of 30%. That goes up to 70% in some of our First Nations communities. We need immediate action that addresses not only climate issues, but social issues in our community. So CBRM Forward, a group created by CBRM, has created areas of focus around housing, job creation, transportation, and environmental issues. Clean, ACAP, and the Climate Change Task Force are trying to ensure that last one, environmental issues, is a lens through which you create solutions for all of the other issues that you're trying to address in society here in CBRM. Provincially, Emma mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals Act and how that's translated into an environmental goals, Sustainable Prosperity Act. It's tough. We recognize that there's always room for improvement, but again, we want to be pragmatic and take advantage of the opportunities that are being created by those changes in legislation. Also, the Electricity Act, which is allowing for more shared solar projects. It's exciting to see changes in the way that we do net metering and provide access to solar for those most vulnerable populations in the province. I think I'll leave it there. I do see some calls for Q&A, so I'm happy to dive in on any other topics that folks have questions on.
Thank you, Rob. I see in the chat bar, we have a question coming in from John Caston. So John, if you want to unmute him, Alec.
Can you hear me now? Okay. My name's John Cascadden. I'm a past chair for the Halifax Waste Resource Society and the Community Monitoring Committee for the Otter Lake landfill located in the Halifax Regional Municipality. Some research that I've looked at shows that in the US, some 15% of the greenhouse gases that are emitted come from landfills. That landfills in the US are about the third of highest emitter of greenhouse gases. I haven't seen such a study done in Canada, but I do know that the Otter Lake landfill in HRM has got a front-end processor and waste stabilization facility, which is unique in the fact that it's the only one in Nova Scotia. Halifax Regional Municipality is looking to actually retire these, which would increase the amount of greenhouse gas that would be developed in the landfill itself. I'm wondering, since the level of greenhouse gas being emitted by landfills in general, would it not be a good idea to have provinces work towards making landfills zero greenhouse gas emitters and bringing in better technology to manage the solid waste that is created on a daily basis? We can't get rid of it. It's there, it's going to happen. But right now, most of it's going to landfills. So my question is are landfills not perhaps a good area to focus some effective change in the future?
Which one of our speakers would like to take that question? Emma.
I can start. John, that's a great question. Landfills are certainly a part of the problem. I find it hard, given the urgency of our situation, to choose one sector to focus our energy on improving. That's why I'm excited by Bill 57, where we have a large greenhouse gas goal. And then we do have an opportunity over the next few months to have input into the climate plan. And I think that you, and I'd be happy to chat with you more about this, should pressure the climate change department to be clear about what their plans are for our landfills when there's an opportunity like the one that you're talking about at Otter Lake for us to replace the technology with something more up to date and brings us closer towards net zero. We should absolutely be taking it. Every greenhouse gas, every ton of GHG is reduced is helpful. In Nova Scotia, when we see the breakdown of our greenhouse gas emissions, we don't tend, I haven't seen the breakout for how much of our emissions come from waste or landfills. One of the things I am pushing for is that we have better data collection and better greenhouse gas inventories in the province, so that we have a better understanding about the impact of the various sectors, including landfills, but also buildings and transportation. Right now, all the data that we have is 2 years old and it's collected by the federal government. But BC actually started creating its own greenhouse gas inventory, and there's an interest in Nova Scotia in starting to do our own as well. And that would help us have a better understanding around your question of how important are landfills in Nova Scotia in particular to our climate action. But it's all important, and I'm glad you asked.
Thank you. That's good for me.
Thank you, Emma. Is there any other questions? I did want to mention, if we have time, and I know that we've been talking about the complexity of the issue at hand, and I'm not sure if everyone on the call is familiar with a two-eyed seeing approach. I know Rob has spoken about, Indigenous ways of knowing and Western science and coming together to form solutions. And I think that we have like a 6-minute video, if we have time at the end of this, to watch as a group. So a question is coming from Kyle Marston.
Hi, I'm coming to you all the way from Nova Anglia to the south in the United States. I'm not from Nova Scotia, but I do have a certificate here from the University de Saint Anne from back in the day. So I have very fond memories of your beautiful region. I wanted to bring up carbon offsetting because it's like something that I'm going to have to deal with in another Zoom meeting later. And I'd love to get your takes on it because I feel like it is just too easy to scam. It's a bad idea. And we really need to find something better to discuss than carbon offsetting. So thank you for your time.
Who would like to take that? Emma?
I agree so much with Kyle. We have to reduce emissions. We have to reduce emissions. We can't suck them back in. I mean, there is technology where they're saying they can suck it back in, but it's not proven. But we do have the proven technology to replace the technology that emits them in the first place. So this focus on carbon sequestration, carbon offsets in particular, I mean, those are two different things, but the tracking, the measurements of carbon offsets is a very sketchy system. And you are right to be very suspicious of it.
We have another question in the chat bar from Peter Brown. He says, as individuals, is our best action activism, calling on government and other decision makers to act? Is there an individual action we can take to improve the situation?
I would say there's many individual actions that we can take. So certainly advocating for change from government officials, that is like a personal voyage for everybody. We have to make decisions around that, the level of advocacy and presence in the community that you want to take. Individual actions in your own life. As I mentioned, I come from a building science background around housing issues in Nova Scotia. There are many ways that we can be doing a better job within our built environments. I know it's like the old adage of like, my father would never let me touch the thermostat. I mean, that's a real thing, you know. There are ways that we can, as a community, build better programs and services to upgrade our aging housing stock in Nova Scotia, and that represents such a huge portion of our climate and our GHG emissions. If I can go back just for a second to Kyle's comment as well, around carbon offsetting, there's a strange lens in Nova Scotia that exists. We have one of the only energy efficiency utilities in Canada, Efficiency Nova Scotia, and really most of our incentive programs are based on energy reduction, not GHG reduction. They're not tied to carbon. They're tied to reducing things like peak demand. So they serve the grid and they serve Nova Scotia Power as much as they serve the environment. So changing the focus of how we incentivize people to take action is a really important conversation that I think we have to have with province. Building in a carbon incentive, so people are not just aiming to reduce their the amount of energy they consume, but also targeted incentives that help people transition away from fossil fuels, transition away from wood. There is no financial argument that can be made right now to switch off of wood. You know, it's a comfort upgrade. You don't have to chop wood anymore or haul it into the house, but it's the cheapest way to heat your house. You know, so how do you get around those financial barriers for low-income Nova Scotians as they want to take action on the environment, but they can't afford a greener heating source in their home? So I think there has to be a shift in our focus from the UARB perspective of not just looking at energy, but at GHG.
Yeah, I would just reiterate a lot of what Rob said, just about changing the Efficiency Nova Scotia and UARB's jurisdiction. UARB's jurisdiction does not cover climate, so even if you intervene in one of their processes talking about climate change, even if you tell them that this is a terrible decision for climate, they might hear you and understand you, but they cannot consider that in their decision. So that jurisdiction needs to be updated. And yeah, Efficiency Nova Scotia chases efficiency savings. It doesn't chase carbon reduction. So there is an opportunity for us there. The Efficiency Nova Scotia was created 12 years ago, and that might not be totally accurate. I think it was 2012. And it was created to it's change to achieve energy efficiency, but there might be time for us to reconsider that. I think, this question about individual action is really important, and it was what I was trying to get at in saying, yes, activism is absolutely key. Democratic processes and participating in democracy is absolutely key. I've been mobilizing people across the country to meet with their MPs over the past and MLAs. And I've talked to MPs that have never heard from one of their constituents about climate change. How are they going to make decisions about climate change if they don't think it's an issue to them? So reaching out to your decision and policymakers and telling them that this is important to you and your vote depends on it, which is what motivates them, is really important. I agree that around like these individual actions that Rob is discussing. I also have a background in building science. That's where I focus. I'm working on a startup to create a scalable solution for deep energy retrofits across the country. But, it needs to be state-led. Like if it's going to be done at the scale and speed necessary for the climate emergency, we can't just incentivize change. We need to mandate it. And I can send along, I saw something in the comments asking for our notes. I'm happy to send along my notes, we got a lot more into discussing vulnerable populations near the end of my talks, which I didn't get to finish. So happy to send that. But there's also a really fantastic exercise created by a podcast called How to Save a Planet. And it helps you figure out what is the best way for you to contribute to the mobilization and the actions around the climate crisis. And it's a really helpful podcast around individual action and what we can do as one person.
Emma, I really agree about mandating change, and I think I'm optimistic about things like the net zero 2030 building code as that comes out. Just taking away any space for contrary action. Just one other point. I didn't mean in my previous comments to say like do not advocate for change to your politicians. Like if it's a choice that folks have to make. All I want to recognize from the perspective of like my seat in the climate change task force is that there are many entry points to this position, and people want to do very different things in terms of climate action, and that can absolutely be protesting in the street. That's perfectly fine. It can also be knowing that I work for a health organization or a small community group or a large multinational corporation, and I want to try to embed a climate lens into the day-to-day operations of that organization. Normalize climate action in everyday life.
Yeah. And
sorry.
build on that.
Just want to say, I would support that we not look for just the one thing we're going to do. The thing is that engagement is the most important thing you can do. There's a variety of ways to address this issue, and we just need more people involved in being on the street or getting out there, talking to their politicians and making sure that they're heard. So it's not, let's identify this one thing as the thing that's going to tip this in that direction. There are tons of things people can do. Let's just get out and do them.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, that is my role with the Climate Emergency Unit, is to help you find what you want to do. Like, what are the things you're going to get involved in? So we are hosting workshops and we're mobilizing sectoral tables. We've got an arts and culture table. We've got, we're going to start a health table, emergency responders, to help people motivate their sector. Like Rob was just saying, like, it doesn't matter where you are, you have a sphere of influence. And I think that's what George is saying as well. And I will point back to my call to action at the beginning, where I'm asking folks to send a letter to their MLAs about Bill 57, which is going towards the Committee of the Whole tomorrow evening. And I can forward that along. There will maybe also be a rally, according to some of the what I'm hearing from some of the school strikers.
Good. Emma, I wondered, there is
that talk that you were involved with Seth Klein too. I mean, we have our provincial bill that we need to obviously try to get strengthened. But when Seth reviewed the federal cabinet, I'm kind of new on the ground to some of this. So I found it very interesting that, of course, when we listen to the cabinet ministers being formed, that, of course, we would probably put a lot of emphasis on the new climate environment minister and the role that he would play. But in that presentation, Seth outlined probably 10 or 12 different ministers that would play a huge role in having the federal government do what is absolutely necessary to do. And those being the ones that actually go back to that, the good war where you need that money for infrastructure and you need those crown corporations developed. I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit about that. So it's not just this one person in federal government, it's many who need to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. We could look at the cabinet that was announced federally last week, and you could probably find every minister has a role to play in the climate mobilization if we treated it like the emergency that it is. If you're writing a letter to the MLA tomorrow, to your MLA about Bill 57 at the provincial level, and you're writing on behalf of your organization, a lot of the organizations here are associated with community services, health, right? I think you should include that minister on your email because they want to know that climate change is relevant to their constituents as well. I think that there's a lot of conversations happening right now around healthcare in our province. And that's a very important conversation for us to have. And I appreciate the medical professionals and the healthcare professionals and those working in social services that are drawing the connections between housing and climate and affordability and climate. And I heard both George and Rob speak to that very much as well. So it's really important for us to point at the environment and climate change. It's not just an environment issue, it's a human issue. And it connects to the files of all of the ministers, whether they're provincial or federal. And I'm happy to send along Seth's list if that's helpful. But I think one of the things that was discussed on that talk, during that talk, was people were saying, well, what about this minister? And what about this minister? And again, it's like, whatever minister you're talking to, if you find it hard to articulate their connection to climate, I'm very happy to help articulate that because there will always be a connection there.
Yeah, Emma, absolutely. I think, far too often climate action or environmental action is seen as in opposition to economic action or economic growth. That's just not the case. I think there is proven ways where we can provide meaningful work, meaningful employment, shift our technology, the technology that we use, create jobs in a positive way that grows our economy at the same time as taking really strong environmental leadership. So if you look at the provincial mandate letters that went out to the new provincial ministers, environment and climate change cuts across all departments. There are calls to action for each of those ministers and how they can support one another towards environmental action. It goes back to my point of applying. I often think about in our trade sector, we apply health and safety policy in all of our sectors. All of our organizations have a commitment to the internal responsibility system and safety. It is a lens through which we operate and do business as, a society.
Oh, thank God.
The same type of lens has to be applied in terms of climate change and the decision making that we take.
Just to that point, Rob, we did in another group that I'm with, we did look at those provincial mandate letters, and it was interesting that around the education piece that they actually pulled out the trades piece. And I was thinking about that when you talked about, that pilot project that you have going on and trying to get people engaged in trades. And if we think about the retooling that has to happen, obviously, I think there's a lot of trade skills that will be needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I remember correctly, Nova Scotia is in dire need of trades. Most of the trades, when you look at it, people are in their late 40s, early 50s,
Yes.
and there aren't a lot of young people training in that. And I know you mentioned, Rob, that there was a program. We have one here where we've created a construction company called Level Up as part of the Family Service Association. And they basically initially hired 10 youth who were having difficulty. They were for marginalized groups. They had educational problems, addiction problems, and we put into place supportive structures that allowed them to complete that program and get training in trades. And we plan to keep running that company. If we get to build this 50-unit project, they will do some of the construction and they will get mentoring by skilled tradespeople and then hopefully be able to go on and work in those sectors. But we need to address that job creation part as well. And how do we get people engaged with that?
Yeah, no question. I think those provincial mandate letters spoke to the ambition of doubling our population here in Nova Scotia. We already have a housing crisis. So how do we address the need for increased capacity to house individuals in a way that's equitable and energy efficient and includes all Nova Scotians? And so often tradespeople do not see themselves as a part of the green economy. Building science and environmental issues are not part of a trade certificate. So that's our goal. We are not a trades training organization. We will leave a lot of that up to the organizations that we partner with, but we can certainly provide them with that baseline of building science. If I send an electrician into an attic and they have to disrupt insulation to run a wire, you better have a plan to replace it, or you're going to affect people's health and comfort and environment. So the little things, if you understand the system and how it works, then you can just be a more participate more fully in the green economy.
Great point, Rob. Thank you. So we have 3 minutes left and we have 3 speakers. So I'll give you each a minute, just to final thoughts or call to action. We'll start with you, Emma.
Thank you for letting me be here today and inviting me to be here. I really enjoyed hearing all the speakers and having the questions and discussion. I'd love to chat with you all again. I think that we need to continue to build relationships. This is an intersectional movement. Climate change, like I said, isn't an environment issue, it's a human issue, and we need to be working together. So I want to support the work of the coalition. I hope you can work with me to support the work for climate, because it is one and the same. So thank you.
Thank you, Emma. George?
I think Emma pretty well covered what I would want to say. I think climate is probably the most important issue we face, and the inequity that exists in society right now and the need to change the actual structures, however we manage to do that. We can't continue to function in a colonial capitalist world. It's destroying this world. So how do we shift people out of that and get them to work together to address this?
Excellent point. And Rob, final words from Rob.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, of course, life will be better after the revolution. I always joke, right? Once, the people on this call are not the issue, right? We're all here because we're interested and engaged. The trick is how we take advantage of the opportunities that are before us right now. So we're coming out of COVID, I hope. There's a lot of economic investment and opportunity for us to build back in a different way. So I would encourage people to get involved and collaborate, to have conversations outside of meetings like this. Reach out to organizations. If you're in Cape Breton, stop by the office, but get involved with the Climate Change Task Force. Just be active and promote conversation. Bring a friend.
Thank you to you all. And any last words from you, Alec?
Great stuff. Really appreciate everyone coming out today, and we'll look forward to the next webinar happening very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
And
you
will
all.
you be posting the recording online, Alec?
Yes, I will.
Yes.
I'll try and get it up by the end of the week.
Okay, that's great. So if anyone has missed it, or they can send the link or whatever, that's great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry.
Have a great day.
Thanks to-
Stay safe.
Thanks to all the speakers. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.